Xiaomi has always been impressive at creating really high-end experiences for reasonable prices. They consistently release phones with top-end specs for a fraction of the price of other manufacturers. And being from the US, I've wanted to always have that experience and see what Xiaomi phones actually felt like. And so while I tried a Xiaomi Mi 5 years and years ago, I never really got the experience of a flagship phone that could run on my network. And so that's why I recently imported the Xiaomi Mi 10T, because I wanted to experience what a high-end Xiaomi flagship felt like and whether it made sense to import it. Well, let's talk about it. This is an OISO, and this is the Xiaomi Mi 10T review. From a visual standpoint, the back of the Mi 10T and the frame of the Mi 10T looks incredibly premium. Like a lot of other flagships nowadays, it has a frosted glass back with a cool little pattern, a gradient pattern across it, and then a metal side edges that are relatively thick and easy to hold on to. The ergonomics of this phone are quite good, so it's quite easy to hold in one hand comfortably without worrying about it slipping out, with the exception of the sidewalls actually being relatively glossy. And so I found that after I've held onto it and a little bit of sweat has gotten along the edges, it actually feels like it'd slip out of my hand a little bit. Relative to other phones I've used this year, the Xiaomi actually has quite unique design language. It's got a flat top and flat bottom, and then a huge curve on the back that actually makes the bottom of the device thicker than the top of the device. This is kind of odd because it means that the actual footprint of this device is a little bit deceiving, where you think that this is the whole footprint, but it actually becomes thicker at the back. And in ergonomic terms, while it does feel comfortable to hold the device in one hand, I will say that this phone gives off a little bit of a cheap vibe with its kind of glossy finish. It doesn't feel nearly as premium as a lot of modern phones with a frosted back or the metal edges. There's something about it that feels like it's more discount. The camera bump is massive, and it really pushes the idea that this is a camera-focused phone, not only with how large and the positioning of the camera bump, but also the fact that the labeling and branding is horizontal, and so it's supposed to be viewed horizontally like many Huawei phones in the last couple of years. Flipping to the front of the phone, it's where the design gets a little bit worse. Now, I'm not too concerned with having equal sized bezels across the entire device, but the additional size of this chin is noticeably larger than any of the other bezels. And so visually, this does look like a more entry-level phone. Where the Mi 10T really sets itself apart is in the display. Now, this might look like a pretty normal 1080p 6.7-inch display with a hole punch kit out, but it actually is quite a bit different. Now, instead of an OLED, it is an LCD. And so we'll talk about that in a second. But it also runs at 144 Hz refresh rate, which is significantly faster than most other phones released last year. And you really can feel it in day-to-day experience. Like, this thing flies and it's very smooth. And I actually got the experience, more so than other phones, of like more smoothness. Now, let's talk about the LCD for a second. I usually wouldn't stray away from an LCD because I think more recent LCDs, like on the iPhone XR, were actually okay. They were actually good enough for me, but this display is not. I really wanted to really enjoy using this display because 144 Hertz was one of the fastest, smoothest experiences that I've had on a smartphone. But outside of that, the display itself doesn't look visually good. So not only does the brightness not really get as bright as many OLEDs today, but you've got these weird shadowing effects around the edges of the display where you have light leakage. So, for example, on the bottom of the display, if I put on a white screen on the phone, you can actually see a faint amount of shadows coming up from the bottom. And the same goes for around the camera, around the front-facing camera. Once I noticed these shadowing effects on my phone, I couldn't unsee them. So when watching videos on YouTube, I actually saw the little shadow around the camera cutout, and it really bothered me, and it felt like a significantly less premium experience. Now, Xiaomi had a couple of reasons with going for LCD over OLED. First of all, it's likely cheaper. They could achieve the 144 Hz refresh rate, and there's no fear of burn-in. And they say that there are some people that actually have negative effects that can't view OLED screens without it bothering their eyes. And so I'm glad that they're reaching out or doing something for those people. But for me, I think this is a significantly worse experience than most other phones. with the exception of the refresh rate. Now, whether it's the refresh rate or the performance or the optimization, something about this phone feels incredibly fast. It feels super smooth just moving around the interface. It feels super fast to open new apps, and just it feels nice. Now, a couple things contribute to that. Not only does this feel fast because it has the high-end specs of most flagships from last year, but also, surprisingly enough, the software experience actually contributes to that fast experience. Based on my experience with the Poco F2 Pro last year, I fully expected to pick up the Xiaomi Mi 10T and totally be disappointed by the software experience. The Poco F2 Pro had a lot of difficulties for me, and I'm not the type of person to install a custom ROM on top of my phones. Instead, I'm really an out-of-box experience type of guy. I really want to just take the phone out of the box, maybe tweak a couple settings, and have the type of phone that I want. And generally, that's not really the case with the Xiaomi Mi 10T. But there's one saving grace, and that's the fact that in the Mi 10T, there is a significantly better haptic sensor or haptic feedback than most other phones that I've used in the last year. It is more similar to iPhones than just about any other Android phone that I've experienced. And not only is the engine better, is the actual vibration motor better, the fact is Xiaomi added a lot of custom vibration throughout the interface. And so the classic swiping down from the top and then swiping away notifications or doing certain gestures actually triggers the haptic feedback, which I really appreciate because it made navigating this phone not only feel faster, but more interactive. It really testified to the case of an Android that's basically the iPhone equivalent. The experience is the most important thing. And I hope in upcoming years we'll have more Android manufacturers that are more interested in creating this sort of experience. Unfortunately, this experience still wasn't perfect. I don't love the stock launcher on the Mi 10T, and there are still a couple bugs here and there, notably with the way the keyboard pops up, that significantly bother me that I wish I could fix. And granted, I probably could fix if I ran a custom launcher. It's just not the sort of effort that I'm willing to put in. And what really added to that poor experience is actually not a software feature, but instead a hardware feature in the fingerprint sensor. Now, admittedly, I've never enjoyed using side-mounted fingerprint sensors. I've never found one that I really love. And I've always thought that in-screen or rear-mounted fingerprint sensors are better for me. And this one is not an exception. Now, not only does the recognition not work as often as I'd want it to, there are significant amounts of time. There were several times where I've just rested my finger on the fingerprint sensor and it hasn't worked. Maybe I missed it a little bit, or maybe my finger is a little bit greasy. That happens significantly more than a rear-mounted or an in-screen fingerprint sensor for me. But also, the button itself, the power button itself, rattles a bit in its housing, and that just contributes to what feels like a significantly cheaper experience on what should be a more flagship experience. Finally, let's talk about the cameras. Now, like many phones from last year, this has 3 cameras. Instead of a telephoto lens though, this actually has a macro sensor. So it's standard 64 megapixel, ultra wide 13 megapixel, and then a 5 megapixel macro sensor. Most photos that I've taken on the Mi 10T look good, but not excellent. Side by side with a lot of other cameras, flagship cameras, they stand up, but they don't really stand out. And I generally enjoyed using this camera on this phone, but I will say that photos taken with the Mi 10T look like they've already been passed through an Instagram filter. And sometimes that produces good results, and sometimes it doesn't. And while I tend to like the punchier, brighter colored images, I really think the Mi 10T goes overboard a few times. And one thing that I don't like about it is by default, it actually adds tags to all your photos. And while for me, that means that I can easily identify that I took a picture with the Mi 10T in my huge album of all my phones, it really doesn't feel like that premium of an experience when I have to go in and turn off that setting so it doesn't show that watermark on every single photo. Okay, let's get to the bottom line. The Mi 10T at its price point is an incredibly impressive phone. And what I love about it is the fact that it really differentiates itself from a lot of other flagships on the market because they make different choices. So if 144 hertz refresh rate or a custom ROM matter to you, then the Xiaomi might be the right phone for you. Those aren't things that particularly matter as much to me, and so the Mi 10T isn't necessarily something that I'd pick for myself. I had really hoped that I'd be able to take the Mi 10T and instantly love it for how premium an experience that I get for such a reasonable price, but I really don't think that's the case. It's clear that they cut a number of corners with the display quality, the side-mounted fingerprint sensor, and the overall feel of the phone that make this feel like less than premium experience, and I'm not willing to give up some of my nicer phones for it. This isn't the last that we'll see of the Mi 10T because there's going to be one more video where I compare it with other sub $500 phones. The LG V60, the Samsung Galaxy S20 FE, the iPhone 11, and the OnePlus 8. If you want to see that video, be sure to get subscribed and let me know down in the comments which you think is going to win. I'll catch you in the next one.